I have an uncle named Pete. Or I should say, I had an uncle named Pete. Pete passed away in 2017. And Pete, my Uncle Pete, was always one of my idols, actually. Even though I didn't know him very well because he lived in Costa Rica. And he had lived there since sometime in the 90s, I guess, when he moved down to a community called Manuel Antonio, just on the edge of Manuel Antonio National Park, which is a beautiful jungle area right by the Pacific Ocean. And it's a place where you have monkeys swinging from tree to tree in your backyard. You have the sounds of the jungle approaching. You have Costa Ricans who are just some of the most laid-back people and friendliest people you will ever meet. It is almost everyone's definition of paradise where my uncle lived. Of course, my uncle grew up in Canada. He grew up in Ottawa, the city where I was born. He worked as a salesman and made quite a lot of money and would have had a very bright future if he'd continued. But he decided he wanted a different life. He wanted a quieter life, perhaps. Or perhaps it wasn't a quieter life he was after. Maybe it was a life of more adventure. Unfortunately, I never got the chance to ask Pete why exactly he moved away. It's one of those things you realize when a family member or someone close to you is gone, that there are so many questions you didn't have the chance to ask. The big questions that don't always come up in everyday conversation. In any case, I didn't have very many conversations with Pete because he lived in Costa Rica, I lived in Canada, and sometimes I would do a Skype call. Before the days of Zoom, when everyone used Skype, we would do a Skype call around Christmas time, and I would be in Winnipeg just freezing, stuck in 4 sweaters trying to stay warm. And there would be Pete in his flip-flops and no shirt on, just hanging out in his backyard. The sounds of monkeys behind him, sometimes in the trees. And I just thought that was so cool, Pete had actually done it. So many people dream of getting away and finding their piece of paradise, but he had actually done it. And when Pete moved to this place, it's quite touristic now. There's more and more hotels and hostels opening up. But when he moved there in the 90s, there wasn't very much tourism at all. And, well, I'll get to this next part later, but needless to say, Pete was a bit of a pioneer, and maybe just a little bit of his spirit has made it into me with the places I choose to travel to. In any case, when Pete passed away, I was still living in Vancouver, and I had recently quit my job. It would take too long right now to get into all the reasons and the story of my job and my life, but maybe that's for another podcast. For now, the point is, I was at a turning point in life. Before that, I'd been traveling all around Asia, and then I moved back to Vancouver, and I found a desk job, and I tried to make it work in, I guess, normal society, air quotes, normal. When you're someone who travels and tries to make a career, being a creative person and making a living and being a freelancer and all that stuff, going to a desk at every day at 9 a.m. and working alongside other people definitely seems normal. But I couldn't do it. It was a good job. It was an okay job. I liked my coworkers. My boss wasn't too bad. It was a nice office space. It was a cool space in downtown Vancouver, Fridays we would have beer parties, and it was a tech job, so it was pretty laid back in some sense, but the work was just so meaningless. And I'd already had a little taste of what it was like to make YouTube videos and connect with people. and actually create some content that reached people and mattered on some sense. Even if it only got 50 views, maybe 2 of those people left really nice comments saying, "Hey man, keep going. Like, I really like your perspective on this country," or, "Hey man, thanks for the advice. I'm going to use this on my trip to Thailand. That was really cool to share that." And you just get that feedback and you feel it. You feel that glow inside that you are reaching someone, that you're using the internet in effect for what it's meant to be used for, which is connecting with people. Not just doing the mindless garbage of advertising some app that people don't really need to use and trying to upsell them on some program. And so I quit that job and had decided that I just wanted to find a way to make a living out of being a filmmaker or making videos or being a writer or doing something where I created something from my soul. Are you building your own dream or are you building someone else's? I knew that being a traveler couldn't last forever. I wouldn't be young and staying in $5 hostels forever, but I just felt that I had to do it. I had to take that leap. And so I quit that job and got some weird looks from my coworker in the HR department. You always do when you're kind of breaking away from the established path and trying something different. But I did it anyway and started to make some videos around Vancouver and eventually started to get some confidence with what I was doing. And that was when something very, very unexpected happened, which is that my dad told me that my uncle, who was my dad's brother, Pete, was sick. There was a problem with his intestines, a problem with his stomach, and he had to get rushed to the hospital because his community didn't have a major hospital. He had to go all the way to San Jose, Costa Rica. And, well, I knew that was bad, but I didn't know how bad because just a few days later, he was dead. My dad, who'd been planning to head down there and visit him, didn't even have time to get down there and say goodbye. It all happened so suddenly. Pete left behind his property that is where he lived, and he also had a couple little bungalows on the property that he rented out as Airbnbs, as little, bed and breakfast type places. There was a cleaning woman who worked with him. There was, there was 3 dogs and a cat. Sasha, Buddy, and Cooper were the dogs. And the cat was named Chester. Yeah, I got to know all of them because, spoiler alert, I moved to Costa Rica. My family needed someone to look after the property while we figured out what to do with it, while we figured out the last rentals. We had to find a buyer for the property because it was being split between several people in the family, and I moved down to Costa Rica with my girlfriend Nari, who had been dating for about a year at that time. And we lived in my uncle's old place, which, believe it or not, was called Pete's Place. And we lived in Pete's Place, not knowing how long we would spend there, not knowing where this would lead or whatever, but our apartment lease in Vancouver had just ended. We moved down here. We put out all our winter stuff in storage and moved to the rainforest. And I'll tell you something funny. I never got to know my uncle too well because he was always in Costa Rica. But I got to know him pretty well when I was down there after he had died, because almost everyone I met, from the coffee shops to even at the hardware store, anyone who found out I was Pete's nephew would have stories about my uncle. One Costa Rican told me he was the first gringo friend he ever made, the first foreigner he ever made who was his friend. And yeah, it just taught me a lot about the meaning of legacy and the meaning of you really are what you leave behind, because Pete left an impact on a lot of people around him. And yeah, he was just kind of a hero. Well, maybe hero is a bit of a strong word, but he was a larger than life figure in that community of Manuel Antonio. And I definitely got the sense of that when I was down there. It was a strange set of circumstances that brought me down there. But without that, I'm not sure I would have got back on the travel path, and I certainly wouldn't have made it to Mexico, which was the reason my channel really blew up and the reason I was able to become a full-time YouTuber, which has led to everything in my life in the last few years, including this podcast. I certainly wouldn't be doing this if I hadn't moved to Costa Rica and then to Mexico and then onwards from there. So in some ways, I feel like even after passing away, my Uncle Pete was there just guiding me in the right direction, just offering me the chance to find my paradise, which was actually different than his paradise, because my paradise wasn't Manuel Antonio, Costa Rica. I actually don't like the beach that much, ironically enough, because a lot of travel influencers are all about that beach life, like always hanging out at the beach, drinking their drinks and doing backflips off rocks and stuff. I much prefer the gritty city life where the locals are at. And that's the experience I had in Mexico City, which I guess I'll get into on another podcast.